use carbon pricing revenues effectively. Carbon pricing puts a price on the environmental cost of emitting greenhouse gases. It provides incentives for individuals and industries to reduce their emissions. By pricing carbon across all sectors, in theory, carbon emissions will be cut first where marginal avoidance costs are lowest. This can trigger an efficient, market-based transition to a low-carbon economy. More and more countries are introducing carbon taxes or emission trading schemes. In 2017, carbon revenues raised by governments amounted to $33 billion. But how should one use these revenues? Redistribute the money back to the people? Cut other taxes? Finance public goods and research?
So I'd like to start by inviting Dr. Birgitta Knopf, I was told, who is a Secretary General, Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, and she'll give us a brief overview on the subject of climate pricing as a key author in one of a key UNEP report.
Yeah, thank you very much. So in this UNEP GAP report, it's called, so it's a report issued annually, and normally we analyze the gap in emissions between what the countries promise in terms of emission reduction and what is actually needed to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement, right? And we experienced that this gap in emission is growing in the last year. That's not really a very promising news. But last year we also concentrated on the policies that are needed, because in the end we say we have a gap in emissions that translate in a gap in policies. You could say a policy gap. And we measured this in terms of carbon pricing, because we think that carbon pricing is a very important element in the policy mix that we need for the energy transition. And we came up with a number showing that only 10% of these emissions are priced at a level that would be required to achieve the 2 degrees target. So a huge gap in emissions and a huge gap in the policy of carbon pricing.
Right. Excellent. Thank you very much. So to pick up on that discussion, I'm going to start first and foremost by introducing the distinguished gentlemen, and then I'm going to have them react to carbon pricing in the context of their countries. So right immediately to my left here, we have the Minister for Energy and Natural Resources and the Minister responsible for the Côte-Nord region of Quebec, and that is Jonathan Julien. And then I'll quickly introduce the next gentleman, and then we'll have you respond. Is the Secretary and Director of the Swiss Federal Office of Energy of Switzerland. That is Benoit Revaz. And then finally, we have the former chair of the California Energy Commission and Executive Vice President Robert Weisenmiller. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Jonathan to let us know what your experience is with carbon pricing, but more importantly, let us know what you're doing with the revenues that your models have realized.
Oui, merci beaucoup pour l'introduction. Écoutez, comme vous le savez tous, on est tous ici pour discuter.
Thank you very much for inviting me. We are here to discuss the consequences of climate change, and in Quebec, we should probably start by explaining our system. So Quebec is about 4 times larger than Germany, and we have a very special situation there because our energy system is rather special. Around 99% of our power comes from renewables, simply because 90% of that capacity is derived from our hydropower plants. We have 4% wind energy, and the remainder is generated by natural oil. So if you look at the energy sector, you find that only 49% comes from renewables, So we are the battery for the northwest of Canada. We are facing the same challenges as all the others. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we have introduced a mechanism that seems to be working very well, I think. So we have an ETS system, and we've established that in cooperation with California. And over the past few years, we've generated billions of dollars. So the system is rather simple. We have minimum carbon price, and we also have a cap on emissions, and we're lowering this cap on emissions, which means that we are generating revenue, which comes from these systems. And the real challenge really is not so much to collect these revenues, but to distribute it. So, of course, the citizens and industry both want a payback, and they also want to ensure that we invest in efficiency. This is another important leg of our system. So we do have programs in Quebec that allow us to fund industry or support industry as they make the transition to more sustainable production technology. We have a $3 billion fund, which is called the Green Fund, and we are using this Green Fund to support our work to mitigate climate change. So we provide subsidies for electric cars so that people can switch to electric mobility. We also help with the transition away from oil to other more climate neutral ways of generating energy. In Quebec, we have a lot of water, and we have hydropower, which, as I said, is very important for our country. So that's really what makes us rich. It's our prosperity comes from water. And this, of course, is a major opportunity for us also in terms of our economic development, because it means that we can redistribute this revenue.
Thank you very much. Absolutely. So I'm just going to very quickly move to you, Minister Revaz. We happen to know for a fact that Switzerland has generated, over $1 billion, 1.133, I think, is the last count, in carbon revenues. How are you using those revenues? How do the people benefit?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Actually, we do have a CO2 levy, and I'm talking about a levy. In German, you will say Abgabe, because the proceeds from the levy are redistributed, and we have two mechanisms to do that. Up to 1/3 of this amount is serving for a refurbishment program for buildings. And the 2/3 are redistributed once to the population through a rebate on health insurance costs, and on the other hand to businesses through a rebate on wage costs. We were able to introduce that through this mechanism on stationary fuels only, and not on transport fuels. For transport fuels, the importers must offset part of the emissions they induce, both domestically and internationally, this offsetting.
Fantastic, thank you. Thank you very much. Fair enough. So I'm going to just allow Robert here to give us some comment, but specifically talking about the cap and trade, because when we talk about California, we talk about the US, cap and trade comes to mind. And have you generated any revenue, and what are you doing with that revenue?
That's very good. Thank you very much. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. As you know, California, if it were a separate country, would be the 5th largest economy. And we have we're dealing right now with our changing climate. So we've really put focus on policies to really address greenhouse gas emissions. And certainly one of the key ways to do that is by putting a price on carbon.
Yep.
Now, with that price, I would say in California, that's been a very bipartisan program. It started out under Governor Schwarzenegger and continued on under Governor Brown and has been extended by a 2/3 vote in the legislature. That was, again, very bipartisan. One of the things that's really driven that degree of bipartisanship is the ability to invest the proceeds in ways to help us with the transition. So at this point, cumulatively, it's like $9.3 billion. So that's a lot of money. Now, having said that, it's a very political process to decide how to allocate the money. And one of the things that we do is we rebate to residential and commercial customers the charge on their power and gas bills, so that every quarter customers see basically a reduction in their power cost that comes from greenhouse gas emissions. Now, having said that, the two drivers that really go through how to allocate the money, one is obviously to do investments that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And for California, about half of our greenhouse gas emissions are for transportation. So as you would imagine, a fair amount of that money goes into transportation. It goes into rebates for people to buy zero-emission vehicles. It goes into charging. It certainly goes into various programs for goods movement. And also goes into our communities to move to a more sustainable, more walkable or bikeable areas. So a lot of money goes in that direction. At the same time, high-speed rail gets 25%. We basically see high-speed rail as a key part of really trying to change our transform our transportation system. Now, at the same time, obviously, it's important everyone benefits from California's programs and not just the early adopters who tend to be fairly well-to-do. So about half of the revenues are invested in areas that can help our lower-income citizens or disadvantaged communities. And that can be a variety of different technologies or programs, but the idea is to make sure that that's really something for everyone. And it's also very important to make this very transparent. So every year the Air Board puts out its climate investment report that will go through and identify exactly where the money's going and exactly what the benefits are. To really, again, you have to maintain the political support. And one of the things that's really important in getting that support is trying to make sure everyone benefits, particularly the ones who are disadvantaged.
Fantastic. So I've had a couple of, quite a few reinvestment opportunities here that are sort of across the board. So electric vehicles obviously are taking prominence in terms of where we're spending the carbon revenues. We're talking about health subsidies as well, wage subsidies, I believe I heard. And then from California, residential power and gas bills are going down. That's good to know. I lived in California for 10 years, so that's good to know that that's where it's going. Infrastructure development, charging stations for the electric vehicles, walkable cities, and the rail. So it sounds like, across the board, there's a lot of thought around how these monies will get redistributed, and obviously some low-income programs, and maybe we'll, next round, we'll get into more of those. So I'm going to turn to you, Dr. Knopf. How does that sound to you as a person looking at it from a more technical, academic level? Does that sound about what the models say we should be spending the money on?
Yeah, perhaps for this question, it's not a good idea to look in the models, but to look for the different countries and what they are doing. And we heard 3 spotlights here. And what we did in this report, we analyzed the whole set of countries and looked where countries either implemented a price on carbon or phased out fossil fuel subsidies, because this is often more important in developing countries to look for phasing out fossil fuel subsidies because they set the wrong incentives. And then we already heard it, it's important to think about what do you do with the revenues, and you have to spend them in such a way that this ensures a just transition, right? So it should increase acceptability. And we identified, let's say, 5 major channels, how you could redistribute the revenues. And the first one is to have direct cash transfers, so either to firms or to affected households. This is one channel. The second one is you could decrease personal or corporate income taxes. So having it in a fiscal policy framework and getting the incentives right within this tax framework. The third aspect that was mentioned before is to invest in low carbon technologies or low carbon infrastructures, right? So this is important. The fourth one, you could think about having special assistance for poorer areas, or for example areas that are mostly affected by such a transition. In Germany you would say coal regions, for example. And the fifth channel is then more dedicated to the companies who are in the international competition and that might need some assistance, for example steel or aluminium or so on. So these are 5 general channels, and we have heard very good examples. So from the scientific point of view, these are role models, and it's important, and you mentioned it, it's also important to have a full transparency of the revenues, of the use of the revenues, and this is our experience when looking at different countries. The acceptance is increasing with the transparency of how the revenues are used.
Sounds good. So we've gone very quickly into very successful programs that have been implemented in Quebec and in Switzerland and in California, obviously. So we're going to take a quick interlude to hear what you have to say about this subject. But when I come back to the panel, I'd like you to share a little bit about the challenge putting together these models, and also hone in on how you got acceptance for the community, the individuals, and obviously the businesses that are probably paying more, who've been impacted. How did you get collective buy-in to build such successful models? So when we come back, we can talk about those. Mr. Dialogue, please.
So let's talk about the results of the 3 questions here, if I can get those up on the screens here. The questions, I think, were pretty straightforward. The first one, an effective climate policy needs a price on carbon. We have our first 100% agreement. I had a joke prepared just in case somebody disagreed, but you behaved so well that you don't have to listen to my humor. So congratulations. Do you think green fiscal policies, such as a carbon tax, can help raise a country's welfare? It would be interesting to know what the 6% no's give as reasons. So if you want to tweet us that, that might also be an interesting contribution. And finally, in your opinion, what carbon price should be rightly adopted? You know, this is really the key question. We all agree that we want to have carbon prices, but we also heard earlier, I think it was yesterday, that most of actually our emissions are under some kind of a carbon price worldwide. So the question is, how do we get an effective carbon price? And the group generally agrees that around 50 euros to 100 euros, it starts to look effective. Does anyone know what the carbon price is in the EU today? It fluctuates. There's a trading market. Does anyone know? Just shout it out. 24 euros. Give that man a lollipop. I just looked it up, and that's right on the money there. So we are short of what this group would still consider to be relatively effective. So I would also like to have 2 tweets. One of them I showed earlier. So it was the one that basically said, what are the obstacles? So if carbon prices are so great, why don't we have them? And the second one is from some guy guy named Craig Morris. I don't know who this guy is, but his tweet is interesting. A carbon price is necessary, but not sufficient. So it would help us transition from diesel and gasoline cars to electric vehicles, but it won't automatically get us to cycling infrastructure, for instance. So if this is the low-hanging fruit, if carbon prices are the low-hanging fruit, are we failing to see the tree? We'll still have our work cut out for us after that. So, Linda, I'll hand off to you and you can discuss. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Craig Morris, aka Mr. Dialogue. I like the way he put in his question there quite sneakily. I enjoy that. So here's how we're going to spend the rest of our panel. Number one is some reactions from the poll questions, and then the barriers which were asked again on Twitter. You know, the challenges to this issue. And then, if we have time, I really want to hear your specific country's experience or what you're doing on the transparency issue. You know, what does that look like? Is it a legislative process? You know, how do we let your citizens know about this, and how do you gain acceptance from that? Okay, so there's very many questions to, all together, but let's just start with responding to the audience. You know, and I'll start with you, sir.
Écoutez, j'ai bien aimé voir les réactions.
Ja, es hat mir gut gefallen, das hier zu sehen. I enjoyed to see the results of the survey. I think the biggest challenge for the carbon market in Quebec, I think we are on a good track, actually. We want to show that the action of states is important. We talked about transparency, and it is really a fundamental issue. We must show that the revenues are being redistributed, but we also need to talk about the efficiency of this measure. If we say the sums are redistributed in this and that way, then that's a good thing. And we've done that in Quebec. The revenue goes into the Green Fund, and it's a positive thing. We need to show in our programs and in our measures that they are efficient. A ton of carbon costs $20 on the market today, on the Quebec market. We are taking measures. We are subsidizing vehicles. It costs $8,000 to... that costs us $8,000. And we have allocated $200, or we are expecting $200 per ton within 20 or 30 years. So the ton is being sold expensively, but is this the best program for us? Well, we could also provide subsidies. We could also make better subsidies for the public transport sector. We have to look at what measures are best suited. How do we best reinvest the revenue to have the optimal effect? The measures must be efficient, and then they will be well accepted by the public. Yes, we have a certain tax, but we see that the tax has a positive effect, that it provides a contribution to mitigating climate change, and we do see the reduction in greenhouse gases.
Could you speak to a challenge? You know, when you first introduced this and you're setting up the Green Fund, was that an easy path, or did you have to overcome some barriers?
Alors encore là, c'est un modèle évolutif. Au départ, le plus grand challenge, c'est d'être en mesure.
Nun, am Anfang war at the beginning, the biggest challenge was to communicate that we all wanted it. We included everyone, all the stakeholders, including the trade unions. So we had a good system of communication. Many people accepted this. We want to maintain this acceptance. We need to show the public and businesses that it's a good thing. We need to show them that we are efficient, that the measures that are being taken are efficient. Well, it may be accepted on the first day, but even years later, it must still be accepted. We can't allow our citizens to say, well, money was invested in Quebec, but the government did not manage to get efficient results from it. The big challenge is that the investments are efficient. We need to have positive results. In Quebec, it's clear we need to be courageous and we need to show that it's a long-term thing.
The gentlemen have spoken, so to just kind of give you a wrap up in terms of, putting it together with what you've studied. So I'm going to go over to you, Minister Revaz. And so three things, again, if you could comment on the polls, I'm sure you agree, but you might have some additional commentary, some of the challenges Switzerland has experienced, and also how you dealt with transparency and acceptance of your citizenry.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to react to the third chart we saw, and my reaction would be to wish good luck to a government wishing to start at 100 euro, 80 euros per ton by taxing CO2. In Switzerland, we spent 7 years with only voluntary measures, no floor. Then we saw that it's not working. So we started with a CO2 levy at 12 euros per ton, and with an automatic mechanism adapting the levy if we don't reach our targets. And now, as of today, we are at 90 euros per ton. We can go up to 110, and we are revising the law to be able to go up to 210 200 euros per ton. Then on the mechanism, there is no one-size-fits-all mechanism for the different stakeholders. For the large industry, you need the ETS, the trading systems. Then for the SMEs, we introduced a carrot and stick program, making it possible for the companies, for the SMEs, to make agreements, targets agreements, for reaching different targets of reduction. And if they don't reach these targets, they have to pay a fine of 125 Swiss francs, 120 euros per ton CO2, and to compensate abroad this target.
Excellent. I still want to just press you a little bit here. You started at 12, you're now at 100. Now, how was that transition? How long did it take? How many years? And what did you do to make sure that, that this increase is accepted?
It took 8 years.
8 years.
And the mechanism was defined right at the beginning,
okay,
knowing if you don't reach the target, it will go up.
Okay.
And then we do have this transparent redistribution mechanism. Everyone sees on his bill, his insurance bill, how much he gets back from the levy.
Right. Excellent. So, I'm just curious because we only have, 3-4 countries represented here. I'll be curious, perhaps through Twitter, if you've got experiences from your country, if you could let us know, that experience as well, that would be fantastic. Over to you, Mr. Weisenmiller.
Yeah, well, a couple of things I wanted to say. First of all, the debate we've had back and forth has been between whether to do a tax or to do cap and trade. Now, we have done cap and trade, so we know where we're heading on the greenhouse gas level, and the question is, what's the associated revenue comes out of the auctions? Obviously, if you did a tax, you would know the revenue, but you would not necessarily know what the savings were. I would say Secretary Schultz to this day insist we should have done a tax instead of cap and trade. Now, the reality is with cap and trade, that's part of a much broader series of programs. So that, and a lot of the policy debate in California has been between some sort of control mechanism, basically doing it through regulations or doing it through a market mechanism. And indeed, we have a variety of programs. For example, we have appliance efficiency standards. We have, new construction has to meet specified standards. We have rebates. So we have a variety of programs. So at this point, it's really part of the portfolio of programs is cap and trade. It's not the only thing we're doing. And, at this point, the prices are relatively low. They're like $15. So we're not near the $100. We're not near the level you would expect to really have major impacts, but we have a variety of other programs which, again, are driving things. And as we reduce the cap, we anticipate the prices will go up. And so certainly that means if you were an agricultural processor or, anything else, you're going to be making investments now to try to deal with that increasing prices. Obviously, one of the things we worry about is leakage of people moving, manufacturing out of California because of that. And so again, we really have to do a lot of innovation to make it easier to go through the transformation, although we have not spent very much money on research and development out of the cap and trade program. We have other means of funding that. But again, it's got to be a very broad portfolio to really address the problems.
Excellent. So you touched a little bit of some of the criticism the cap and trade scheme in California and certainly in the US. So how do you respond to people that say, how do you respond to criticism that suggests that it just allows you to continue pollution because you can buy your way out of it. You can just transfer, your carbon emissions to another jurisdiction, maybe, sub-Saharan Africa.
No, I mean, that's a real issue that we are concerned about. I mean, the reality is the California economy is growing very vibrant, and at the same time, we are achieving real reductions in our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, again, you're back to the question of how do you allocate the goods being produced elsewhere, and how does that look? And, one of the things which we see California's role is, California is 1% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So that while we're really suffering right now from the consequences of changing climate, we see the ability of California to show that it's possible to grow the economy while reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and to partner with, along with the relationship we have with Quebec, which has been a fantastic one from the very start. Unfortunately, many other states and provinces dropped off along the way. We have a relationship with China as they put in place a emission trading scheme to say, okay, what's worked in California, what are the things to watch out for? So again, we see California more as a laboratory. Certainly we've made mistakes, and hopefully people can learn from those mistakes, but we've also shown how you can help transform your economy.
Excellent, thank you. Excellent. I'd like to hand over to you, Dr. Knopf, to just comment on what you've heard.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like to comment on two issues.
Yeah.
So the first one is on the price, which kind of price is needed. So there was a commission set up, it's called the High-Level Commission on Carbon Prices, that was led by Stiglitz and Lord Stern, and they came up with a number of that $40 to $80 are needed by 2020. So this is the range, and of course this depends very much on the additional policies that you implement, because we all know that we will not have one carbon pricing and then the full mitigation is done, but we need additional measures. But that's the range, at least they come up with, so that gives an indication for that. And then the question, I think it's quite interesting, when carbon pricing is so convincing, why isn't it not done in more countries, right? And our analysis is that it's not only about information, but it's really how to communicate the whole issue. So you said before you call it a levy, and this already makes a change, right? If you just call it a tax, or if you just say it's a very economically efficient instrument, it's not very attractive. So calling it a levy might be a better idea, or some call it a climate dividend. So wording matters, and the whole framing matters. For example, punishment of fossil fuels that are used, or make a success story. So it incentivizes investments in the green technologies. So that's a success story, right? And not it's a very efficient economic instrument. That's not attractive. So this is one very important component in the communication. And I really recommend everybody to read the World Bank report. It's called Communicating Carbon Pricing, and I think there are very interesting elements in there to put this forward. So this is an important point. And then, of course, when you introduce carbon pricing, it's also important to think about timing and sequencing of different instruments. And the timing is important. For example, if you put very quickly a very high price on the economy, that's very difficult to sell. And I think this was also one of the reasons with the Yellow Vest movements in France that had many reasons, but one was a very high price, and that's difficult for the population.
Excellent, excellent. So 2 challenges I'm hearing, certainly is where you put the price point, and when you put the price point, and how you communicate that, right? So in our last 5 minutes, if I missed anything in sort of the summation, if there's something that you feel has not been discussed, then I'm gonna give you maybe each a minute, because we have a hard stop in about 5 minutes. I'm gonna give you each a minute to give your closing remarks. If there's any burning tweet, Mr. Dialogue, you want to present, put your hand up, I'll let you come. Otherwise, we're just going to close our sessions with a quick lightning round of your parting remarks. Yes, sir.
Alors, c'était très intéressant de pouvoir partager différents enjeux et différentes préoccupations.
So it was very interesting to hear about the different challenges, and the communication is indeed the most important, so that everyone understands what we do. The initial price must be adapted to the process, and I believe that the method we've chosen in California and Quebec to reduce greenhouse gases is a good one, but it's a very soft way of doing things, I believe. And the mistake that we made in Quebec is we have this state company, Transition Énergétique, and we founded that too late, in 2017 only. At that time, emission trading was already in existence, and there was no transparency beforehand. And that is a challenge every day, to show why it is important to work the way we do, and to explain the government action as well.
Yeah, thank you. My summary is that carbon pricing is an important policy instrument for the Paris Agreement, for fulfilling the Paris Agreement. The gap is still huge, but the good news is that carbon pricing generates revenues, and these revenues can be used in such a way that a just transition is ensured, and that nobody is left behind, and that not the energy transition is based on the burden of the poor.
Thank you.
We see many country examples for that already.
Thank you very much. Every time somebody says leaving no one behind, people-centered solutions, it makes my heart sing. So thank you. So Mr. Benoit from Switzerland.
Continuing on the same topic is mobilizing the citizens are deciding on the carbon pricing at the end of the parliament, the representatives of the citizens. But it's still very important to mobilize the industry and the companies on that, because their competitiveness is is very much concerned about that, and to give ambitious but reachable targets linked with a proper pricing for this carbon.
Excellent.
Yeah, I was just going to hit the process question. So in California, we look at, I mentioned the 9.3 billion, the cumulative impact. So that then goes through the budget process every year. So if there's say 1.4 or 1.8 billion, the legislature will decide in that year how to allocate it. Some of it is like the 25% high-speed rail is pretty formulaic, although frankly they can change any of those numbers. That means in July, there would be a decision on how the money is appropriated. And then that will go through a process of competitive, if we're going to put so much, actually some of it, if we're doing weatherization programs, there's a state agency that does the weatherization programs. But if we're going to, say, if we're giving out rebates, again, that's pretty straightforward. But if we're giving money for local communities to really change their land use planning, then that will mean all local communities get a chance to compete for that. And so at this point, there's about 3 billion of the 9 that has been appropriated, allocated, and actually implemented, but the rest of it is somewhere in that process. But again, it's a very, legislature, you can imagine looking at it, 1 year and saying, well, what about agriculture, or what about, these communities, and making adjustments. So it's a very transparent process, but frankly, it takes a while to get the money out and to spend it wisely.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those comments. I think the audience will agree that we can use carbon pricing revenue efficiently to ensure a just and fair transition to a low-carbon economy. It's not all a path of roses. It's not a piece of cake, but it can be done, and we definitely have seen concrete examples of how countries have done that. I want to thank you very much, panelists, and would you please join me in congratulating them.